Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Geopolitical Futures Podcast. As always, I am Cole Altom, Jacob Shapiro, sitting right to my right. How are you, Jacob?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Cole?
I'm doing good. It sounded like you had more to say than doing well, but if you're just doing well, maybe that's all there is to say.
I was debating about being snarky, but I don't have anything that good right now. So.
If you if you have to debate, it's fine. We'll table that. We'll come back to it. I mean, we've got another 30, 45 minutes. Plenty of opportunities to be snarky, right? So, opportunity number one, week ahead.
The week ahead.
You want to talk about Armenia?
Yes, I was going to start with Korea, but let's start with Armenia.
Armenia
is better.
Armenia is better. It is better. It is the buffer between Russia and so many other places. It's really interesting, and more interesting, New York Times finally reported on it.
They did, although we've been looking at it for a while.
Yeah, I know.
So
Why do we care about it?
Well, we care about Armenia because Armenia is located in the South Caucasus, and the Caucasus is one of those spheres of Russian influence that you have to keep an eye on in general, but which you certainly have to keep an eye on in the context of worsening relations between the United States and Russia, and not just the United States anymore. We can say Great Britain, we can say France as well. So when you think about the United States bombing Assad and his chemical weapons, and if you're thinking about where a Russian response might come from, your eyes are automatically trained on the Caucasus. Now, on top of that, there have been really grassroots level protests in the Caucasus, and a lot of the speculation is this Ukraine 2.0? Was this a Western engineered group of protests?
Reverting to some old, reliable, common media tropes about color revolutions. And no, this is a color revolution, and that's a color revolution, but it's probably not one of those.
Well, but when Vladimir Putin looks at the world, he sees color revolutions everywhere, because that is how the West likes to go about creating regime change and expressing its displeasure and messing around domestically in some of these countries. Now, all that said, I believe the title of the piece we published today was not quite a color revolution.
It was something like that, but the U.S. does that?
Sure, the U.S. has been funding NGOs and making statements about things like this.
Shocked to find gambling at this casino.
But Armenia itself, not that important. But when you start to think in terms of, okay, you're in Russia's backyard here, you have something that looks like, when it comes up from the grassroots. The funny thing about giving money to NGOs is that usually it's not effective. Usually you need some kind of match to be struck on a domestic basis that actually hits with a majority of a population, and then it can spill into something like Ukraine, and you can use that momentum to push it forward. But it's not just Russia we're talking about here. Turkey and Armenia have a very complex and historical relationship. Azerbaijan and Armenia basically are still at war. They fire at each other across Nagorno-Karabakh sometimes, which is everybody in Armenia and Azerbaijan always can't believe that no one in the United States has heard of Nagorno-Karabakh, because for them it's the most important thing in the history of the universe, but it really is for them. And, you've got Iran, which is also in this neck of the woods. So just to say that a lot of things are swirling around the Caucasus, and our eyes have been trained there anyway. We don't think these protests are super important, but once you start to get contingent events like these, you really have to look very closely at, well, is anybody pulling strings here? Is anybody going to take advantage of this and try and push it in one direction or the other? Looking right now like that's not going to be the case, but we have to keep a close eye on Armenia.
Well, earlier you mentioned Korea, and that's the big one this week, right? The highly vaunted, much talked about summit is fast approaching.
Yes, so Kim Jong-un and the South Korean President Moon are meeting on Friday, I believe it is, and this hasn't happened for a long time. I have to say that overall, I guess I'm not that excited about North Korea. Maybe it's just because we've been waiting for the other shoe to drop for so long, but this seems all pretty hardwired in. There's a lot of speculation out there about how China is beginning to feel frozen out of this whole situation, which doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because Kim Jong-un was just in China on that big visit, and Xi Jinping, I think we even talked about it on the podcast, said a few weeks ago he's going to go visit Kim. I really do think China is involved here, and everything is going the way that they hoped. But we'll see. We'll see if North Korea continues its friendly phase. So far, it seems to be pushing that direction.
All right, what else?
And then last but not least, this is not in the headlines right now, but this is a project I just tasked out to one of our new interns, I love interns, which is that we're looking at the state of the flow of refugees into Europe. We talk a lot about how the twin problems of economic problems in Europe and unemployment combined with the refugee crisis is what led to the rise of nationalist parties in places like Italy, in places like Germany. It was one of the reasons that Brexit happened. But we actually haven't checked up on those flow numbers in about a year. So what we want to do is we want to go back and see, okay, how many refugees and migrants are currently headed towards Europe? Where are they coming from? Are those trends going to increase based on what's going on in Syria or in other parts of the world? Is it going to decrease? And then what are the different countries doing in response? So you can expect that in the next couple of weeks you'll see a pretty massive update from us on which way it's going. I don't know for now, so you're just going to have to wait on the edge of your seats.
All right. Thanks very much. For our main feature, I want to talk a little bit about a country that you and I, we touch on it just about every single week, but I kind of feel like we've never really given its full due here. And as you know, I kind of like to talk about some of these things from the ground up, from point zero, and give a very broad perspective of these things so that when we talk about them in the future, our listeners have a little bit of orientation, a little bit of familiarity they might not have. So that country is Russia. Russia's been a little bit of a boogeyman in the United States. There are weird talks and weird rumors about a new Cold War brewing. We'll kind of get to that and why we don't necessarily like that, but also do here in a second as a phrase and a terminology. But take us through Russia. Let's start at the beginning. If you wanted to educate me or somebody else on Russia, what would you say? Where would you begin?
Well, I would begin by telling anybody that's going to listen to us talk about Russia by putting our cards clearly on the table. We try, and I think most of the time are as objective as possible, and yet no matter how hard you try, there's no such thing as perfect objectivity. Sure. We are two Americans sitting in the United States right now,
not Russian,
and we are talking about Russia. We have no polemical point that we want to make here. Really, I think the goal for us is to try and explain what is going on right now between not just the United States, but the West in general and Russia right now. Why is Russia doing the things that it is doing? How is it seeing the world? How does that translate into its relationships with foreign countries?
You've been to Russia, though, right?
I have been to Russia. I've been to Russia twice in my life. And I've been treated it's been very friendly both times, and I actually find that Russians have a better sense of humor about this sort of thing than most Americans do. It's also a generational thing. People who remember the Cold War have a much different relationship in their minds with Russia than people who, we have adults walking the earth right now who don't know from the Soviet Union. They never had to even imagine that the Soviet Union existed.
That's true.
So there are generational gaps there too. I would say also in the United States, just as a random aside, there are generational gaps in China, because those who are around for the Cultural Revolution and who remember some of the far left's fascination with Mao and remember the Great Cultural Revolution have a different relationship than the people for whom China was just where their iPods got made. So anyway, we can maybe get back to that later.
I've been to Russia as well.
Oh, you have?
I have. It was a long time ago. We're talking 15 years, give or take. Not to expose my age too much, but I always like sharing this little anecdote just because it's, you'll see why. I within hours after my arrival, I'll say one day because I don't remember exactly, but it was within a couple hours of my arrival, I saw some things that just kind of like blew my mind. I saw just a man walking a bear on a leash, which I thought was amazing. And then, like moments later, I'm in a cab and I look up and I see no joke, an elderly woman, like an old woman, on the very top of this like very, very dangerous, perilously rickety scaffolding, just throwing cinder blocks off. Like that was her job. And I was like, this is the hardest place I've ever seen in my entire life. And I thought it was cool. I thought it was great. But I'm not trying to like reduce Russia or anything like that. But as my dad says, you can only make first impressions once. And that was my first impression of Russia. And I always think about these things anytime we bring it up. But back to more academic pursuits.
Yeah, I don't quite know how to follow that up. I can tell you that the small town that I grew up in Georgia, not the Republic, somebody stole a zebra from somewhere and put it in the small local college that was located in the town. So these crazy stories are not just Russian.
Well, yeah, and if some tourist had been your little podunk town, they might have been like, wow, this place is obsessed with zebras. So, who knows? It's all a matter of perspective. I assume y'all are not obsessed with zebras. Let's go back to Russia.
Let's go back to Russia. Yeah. See, we got our snark in there anyway.
Yeah, well, it was only a matter of time.
Look, one of the things we do at GPF that I think sets us apart, and not just sets us apart in terms of quality, but also makes us objective and keeps us honest, is that we try to think about things in terms of geography and not in terms of ideology. So when I think about Russia, and I've been doing some research on my own for Russia lately for other reasons, but I try to define, well, what is it that Russia needs to do geographically? What are Russia's geographic interests, and how does that map on to what they're doing? For a basis of comparison, when I look at the United States and I try to break the United States down into what its geographic interests are, the United States has solved all of its geographic interests. It has conquered the entire length of the Mississippi River. It controls the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, so nobody can approach from either side. Canada is not about to invade the United States, and neither is Mexico. So the United States is one of these rare countries that has fulfilled all of its imperatives, is the word that we use internally to describe this.
There's a couple things I would actually add to that. One, to add to the thing you said about geography, that also, not only does it make us objective, it also necessarily makes us big picture. And when you're looking at the big picture, if you're looking at like the timelessness of these things, you kind of understand why some of these things are little blips and not necessarily the big dramatic episode that they're made out to be. One. But to go back to the United States, you're absolutely right. No arguments about Canada, nor about Mexico. Our Navy is good. We own the seas. But something we do like to talk about, and it was the subject of an earlier podcast, was Cuba. You could almost argue that that's one very small, it's neutralized. It's not a threat to us, but that's not exactly the territorial possession it used to be for us, and therefore does kind of jam us up a tiny bit in the Caribbean and in the Gulf of Mexico. I just would welcome your thoughts on that if I'm really reaching here.
You're not reaching. I would just say it's neutralized. In the 1960s, it was not. And the reason you had the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the reason that touched such a nerve, not just in the United States domestically, but also at the upper echelons of the U.S. government, was because if the Soviets had been able to establish basing rights there, that would have been a very big deal. If you had China today exploring that same type of relationship, you can guarantee that the United States government would be buzzing over it. But in general, I would say that Cuba is neutralized, and that's not something the U.S. has to worry about on a daily or even yearly basis. I mean, that's neutralized for now. I say all that to say, and I use the United States as the foil there, because one of the reasons we think of Russia as unstable from our perspective is that Russia has not fulfilled those imperatives. Russia has certain things that it needs to do in order to protect its core territory, and those things it has not achieved, and it is trying to achieve them. And when you're thinking at just the very simplest level, when you're thinking about what Russia is doing, it is trying to protect itself. It is trying to protect that core area. And the biggest challenge here is understanding what Russia sees as that core area and what it's going to do to protect it.
Right, and important to remember, you talked about generational changes. What we now call Russia was the Soviet Union back in the Cold War, of course. Its borders have changed within our lifetime. And we're not all that old. Well, you're not. But so it's just important to keep in mind, like these borders are artificial, and they're fluid over time. And that's why we focus so much on geography. But
they are artificial, but Russia's particularly interesting in the sense that though those outer borders have changed many times, Russia has basically existed around a core territory around Moscow since about, you could argue what century, I would say around the 15th century. That's when you've got Ivan the Great, and you really have Moscow established as a major center. And it's a really weird place to have your core geographic territory because it is incredibly vulnerable in all directions. It was actually, the Russia ended up where it was around Moscow because they were retreating from a lot of different wars and Mongolian hordes and this, that, and the other thing in Eastern Europe. And so, Moscow becomes this area that is the center of what becomes the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union and the Russian Federation. And that has never changed. But at the same time, what has never changed is that core area has never been perfectly secure. Napoleon tried to march to Moscow. Hitler tried to march to Moscow. Moscow's memory is of all of these countries coming in off of that flat European plain and trying to attack. So as soon as you control Moscow and this area around Moscow, your first imperative has to be to extend out so you have some kind of buffer space. And for Russia, that means extending out to the east to the Ural Mountains, which is a pretty good place to defend that core territory. You have to extend out west. You really can't extend out west far enough if you're Russia, but usually it's around to the smallest gate where the approach.
Right. There's really no barrier there. We talk about that a lot. It's just there's just openness basically. Only when it funnels can that actually be sort of.
So you try and get as far as you can on the funnel, north up to about St. Petersburg, where you start getting large bodies of water and it gets impassable because of all the Arctic, and then you want to get to the heart of the Volga River where it originates in the Caspian. So you go all the way down the river, and that sort of becomes your core territory. And this Russia holds right now. And then when you think about what Russia is doing in each of its iterations, it is basically trying to protect that core area. The reason that, and if you think about Russian history, Russia extended out to the east towards Siberia all the way to the Pacific first, because it actually didn't have that much of a threat from Eastern Europe in the 15th and in the 16th century. That begins to change later on. The major threat was the Mongolian hordes, because the Mongolian hordes, whether it was Genghis Khan or the all these different Mongolian hordes that we don't think of Mongolia as a major player today, but it used to be a really big deal. Yeah. Russia had to go east in order to secure itself from any threat originating on the massive Eurasian steppe. And that again speaks to some of these buffer zones, like Central Asia becomes crucially important.
Armenia blocks it off from the Middle East.
Exactly. Once Russia did that, it came back, and before it could even think about extending to the west, it had to create a centralized political system that could control all of this territory. Like I said, remember, Russia's core is this Moscow region.
It's very small, and the rest is freaking huge. It's the biggest. It's gigantic.
And it had to extend all the way out to the Pacific just to make sure that whether it was China or the Mongolian hordes or eventually Japan, when Japan rose, that they couldn't threaten Russia. And what Russia had to do was it had to create a national identity that was fluid enough to integrate those people into it. And it has mostly done that. Those people feel Russian, and Russians think of themselves as Russian. There's not a lot of clash there. Russians have a much more complicated relationship, I would say, with Muslims and Chechens in the Caucasus, and maybe we can get to that in a second. But then second of all, you need a centralized system that controls these people. And that's why today it's the FSB, it used to be the KGB, before that you had the Tsars had their own internal security services. Russia is a much different kind of political experiment than the United States.
Fair to say that it's to the extent that these things can be sort of given to centrality and given to, I don't want to say authoritarianism outright necessarily, but strength from the center.
Russia has to maintain control over a vast multi-ethnic territory. And this is not easy. It was not easy for the United States. The United States fought a massive civil war over controlling territory, and one of the geographic wonders of the United States is that the United States has succeeded at projecting power past the Rocky Mountains. The way the United States does that, that's where ideology really counts, because the ideology and the governing structure of the United States allows it to work those areas in. Russia can't take that kind of chance. Now, once you do all that, once you have eliminated the threat from the east, you have control over Moscow, you have a government apparatus and an ideology and a culture that can work all this in, then you really need to start thinking about your threats from Europe. And this is where Russia's imperatives basically break down, because Russia right now has control over the vast multi-ethnic territory. There are no threats to the east. Although if you're thinking about the Russia-China relationship, that one has to be worrying for them no matter what they say about how friendly they are with China. And they have control over the Moscow region. They also have control out of the Caucasus Mountains. They do not have the control that they are used to and that makes them feel secure in Eastern Europe. That is the major weak point, because Russia, whether it's by direct control or whether by client states or whatever you want to call it.
Neutralization through destabilization like we see in Ukraine.
Exactly. They want to extend all the way out to the Carpathian Mountains in Europe, and then north of the Carpathians, you want to have as much space as you can so that if somebody's going to come at you in Moscow, they die in the Russian winter. And then you go and retreat and wait for winter to pass, and then you go hit them with your superior size, technology, whatever.
Sheer number of
whatever
as well.
Yeah. So I say all that to say, when I look at what Russia is doing, I see that Russia feels insecure because it has not established some of these basic imperatives for the security of that core region. The best metaphor, if I want to go back to the U.S. foil here, because a number of our listeners are going to be U.S., is imagine if the U.S. did not have direct control over California. Imagine that a foreign power maybe not even a foreign power, whether California was independent or whether somebody abroad was stoking California and paying NGOs in California to have views that you didn't like, the United States would act a lot differently probably in its foreign policy if it felt that threatened. And then sort of the last thing to say here, and I'm not the first person to say this is not novel, but Russia is really a land power. It eventually has to defend from maritime threats, because if Russia extends out as far as it can to these buffer zones, it comes up on oceans, and if you're going to protect yourself from the threat from an ocean, you're going to need a navy. But Russia really has a lot of land that it has to manage, and it's very costly to do so before it can start thinking of projecting maritime power. And Russia also, there's no outlet for Russia. If you're in St. Petersburg, you can be blockaded in any number of ways. The Arctic is frozen, and even if the Arctic weren't frozen, and some people say it's not going to be, it doesn't have to be the United States, any navy could block in both ends of it and keep Russian ships in or out as they please. This is why the Russian relationship with Turkey is so complicated, because the Black Sea does lead into the Mediterranean, but you have to go through the Bosporus, and Turkey can block the Bosporus whenever it wants. So Russia is stuck in the situation where it has to expand, get huge, and then it can't access maritime trade without the permission of others. If you want to understand where Russia's coming from right now, it's looking at the board and it's saying, this is not as secure as it needs to be. And if we look at Russian history, we know that threats come from these particular areas, and we are really weak on this one axis.
You could call it like one of geopolitics' greater ironies. It's just so big. Russia is so big and so massive. And despite all of its posture and its military, it's just insecure. It's an insecure place, and it's always worried. And I bring that up to say, now that you've kind of given us a little bit of history of why Russia does behave the way it does, and we've established that most of these threats, the things that keep Russian leaders up at night, emanate from their western frontier, Eastern Europe, and further west as well. That sort of explains why it interacts with the only global superpower now, the United States, the way it does. Now remember, the Soviet Union was a superpower, the United States was a superpower. That all ended, U.S. came out on top. The Soviet Union, it lost all these holdings in Eastern Europe, and its borders went back to the east, right? And the United States, part of that almost like negotiated withdrawal when these things were coming to an end, said, hey, we're going to respect some of the territorial integrity. We're not going to move in on the Baltics. We're not going to move into Central or Eastern Europe. And then we did. That's like immediately we did. And then so all these countries are now either like NATO members, or some of them are EU members, or they're trying to be both, or one or not the other. So Russia does have a deep and maybe even well-earned skepticism of the West generally, and the United States specifically. So it's a long way of saying that the way they interact is the way it is for a reason. Can you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, yeah. I mean, you kind of hit the nail on the head right there, which is that Russia thought that it sort of had a handshake agreement with the United States after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and there were elections, and Russia was going to be welcomed in as the next liberal democratic brother in the international fellowship of blah, blah, blah. From the Russian perspective, the United States kind of reneged on that. The United States started placing missiles and started talking about deployments in Eastern Europe that Russia couldn't see any logic for besides being a direct threat to Russia. And then on top of that, and this is where the domestic becomes part of the geopolitical, Russia couldn't be governed in an effective manner if there wasn't strong centralized leadership. The years, in Russia after the Soviet Union had collapsed were disastrous. They were chaotic. It was not a good time. The reason that some people doubt Vladimir Putin's popularity ratings. I don't doubt his popularity ratings. People in Russia have a good view of Putin because Putin was the one who was able to supply some semblance of order. I don't think that has so much to do with Putin as it does with the idea of Putin. The idea that there is someone who is going to return Russia to its former glory, and you see these figures pop up in Russia all the time. This is what I say, where ideology I don't think drives circumstances. I really do think that geography and some of these impersonal forces that we talk about create ideology, and they create ideological realities. One of the interesting things about Russia right now is that it's almost unideological. The only thing that is really important is the Russian nation, and they're willing to erase all sorts of things in public memory as long as the Russian nation is protected. So, in some ways, like history for Russia right now, they forget about the whole Soviet period and forget about all the Russian Revolution. They'll just
must be nice.
They'll pick things from here and there and try to assemble this national identity. And then, something we haven't talked about, and this is fraught for Americans to talk about this, but Russia's demographics are really bad. And when I say really bad, I mean the population is aging. I mean that the share of the population that is generally considered Russian or Orthodox Christian is declining. Some of the parts of the population that are increasing is that Muslim part of the population. Are these parts of Russia that have not quite bought in? A lot of Russia has, but some of them haven't. You might remember. Well, I don't want to. About a year ago, we were writing about Tatarstan and about banking problems in Tatarstan and about how Russia declined to extend an agreement that gave Tatarstan a certain amount of autonomy. This is an area that...
Tatarstan being one of the sort of semi-autonomous republics in the North Caucasus, for those unfamiliar.
No longer really semi-autonomous, because the central government in Russia said, well, this is actually something that threatens that first imperative I talked about, control of the Volga River system. Volga River goes through Tatarstan. Russia's under threat here, both from abroad and from its own economic difficulties, and we have this semi-autonomous region with banking crises, and that also doesn't feel, has this separate identity going back many centuries.
Well, and worth noting too that Tatarstan is what Tony Soprano would call a good earner. They actually they actually have some semblance of economic vitality. They produce some oil and I believe some raw materials. I don't have any figures in front of me. Mm-hmm. So it's an important. It's not just for pride or for nationalism's sake. There's a bit of a strategic value there as well. Excuse me.
Well, no, and again, though, this is fraught because I guarantee you that in places like Russia or in China, when they look at the United States, you can divvy up the United States ethnically too. You can say, well, X% of the population is African American, and X% of the population is Latino, and and you can say, oh, well, we see from the election that there are so many divisions in the United States. How is it that the United States can project any kind of centralized view? And the thing here, and the litmus test for this is, even some of those groups in the United States that are not happy think of themselves as American. There are groups inside a country like Russia that don't necessarily think of themselves as Russian. If you are, from Dagestan, or you're from Chechnya, and you are an observant Muslim, and you speak a different, probably you speak Russian, but there are other languages that would also be your mother tongue, or you just have different ideas about how the world's going to look, those people aren't saying, I'm Russian. They're saying, well, no, I'm Chechen, and I'd like my self-determination, please. Like, I thought the Soviet Union was over. Why is this still being ruled? So it's complex, but just to say that, within Russia, you have a pretty difficult, fractious situation on top of all the threats that we talked about.
You brought up Vladimir Putin, long-serving leader of Russia right now. We all know that. He was on the front lines of the Cold War. He's a KGB guy through and through. And he was like on the ground working espionage in places like Germany and Hungary and some of the other places, right? So that's his mindset. That's where he's from. That's his world. So it's not wholly surprising that he kind of brings that sort of ethos to the presidency, if you want to call it that. Now, bringing that up to say, there's a term that you hear recurring in the media right now, and I've got some pretty conflicted feelings about it. We can talk about it, but people keep harping on Cold War 2.0. This is the Cold War again. This is more Cold War this, more Cold War that. What do you think about that?
Well, we can't just fault the media for this, because politicians on both sides are also using this rhetoric now.
I strongly disagree. I think we can blame the media for anything that we want to, but please continue.
I'll let you do that.
Thank you.
But there is definitely a sense on both sides that there is some sense that there is this kind of Cold War brewing. I would say that, first of all, Russia is not the Soviet Union. No. The Soviet Union was a much more powerful entity than Russia. It also had much larger ambitions. The Soviet Union was a version of Russia that had achieved a lot of those imperatives that I just said. The current iteration hasn't. So the Soviet Union was at that point of trying to defend from maritime threats and defending what it already had. Russia today has to have a much more narrow focus. Russia today has to maintain control over the Caucasus, maintain some semblance of influence and control in Central Asia. you've got both Japan and China on the Pacific really knocking on the door of global power. And while Russia is in some ways declining and has bigger threats, more oriented towards Europe, Russia basically has very little control right now in Europe itself. It has certain countries which are more sympathetic to it, but nothing like the Soviet Union.
And there's no theaters really that it's involved in like it once was. It's certainly involved in Syria, and we can and have talked about that at probably longer lengths than we should have, but that's like one of two. You could say Ukraine, you could say Syria, and that's about it right now. You can't really say that during the Soviet Union. It was a totally different world, like you said. So that's kind of why I have some quibbles with the term Cold War, because not only is Russia fundamentally different, and the United States, for its part, is fundamentally different, but the world is different. They were more or less equals. You could debate that too, but it was a bipolar world. It was you were in this camp or you were in that camp, and that is... It's not really the case anymore, so I kind of feel like that comparison falls flat on its face. I don't want to get too semantic about it, but...
No, it's important because there are certain tropes that societies fall back on because these things are messy. Like, it is not easy to understand these things, and you have a ready-made...
Exactly. Calling it Cold War makes it a lot easier. It simplifies things, for better or worse.
But I think you actually hit on something important which actually helps light the way here, which is that the Cold War was really a bipolar conflict. It was between the Soviet Union and the United States, and those were the two main heavyweights, and they were slogging it out. If you listen to Russians in the media or a lot of Russian newspapers, you will see the phrase, and I've said this before on the podcast, the multipolar world is emerging. Right. So Russia is not thinking in terms of a bipolar struggle between Russia and the United States. The world that Russia wants to see and the world that Russians think is emerging is a weakening United States and areas around the world where power is more distributed. So Russia sees China has significant power. It sees Japan has significant power. It sees Turkey as amassing power. Worryingly for Russia, it sees Poland is starting to have a little bit of a dominant position now in Eastern Europe. Britain and France just went in on the United States and bombing Syria too. So, the old friends from past generations are also still there.
It's all very familiar.
But I think that's the key thing. The Cold War was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. The imperatives of both were mutually exclusive and were about global domination. Because when you got to as powerful as the US was and as powerful as the Soviet Union was, the only next step was to try and neutralize your enemy. That is not the position that Russia is in right now. Russia is not powerful enough or secure enough to try and challenge the United States. What Russia needs and what Russia wants is to define its interests very narrowly, to make sure that the things that are most important to Russia it can achieve, and try to make sure the U.S. doesn't mess around with that too much, right? So for Russia, right now they're on the level of, they don't control Central Asia. They don't perhaps have as strong of a hold on the Caucasus as they used to. They have much less resources in Europe than they used to. These are more narrowly defined interests, and when you think about Russia and Syria, it's less about Russia challenging the United States for global hegemony. It's first it was for domestic reasons to try and rally Russians around the flag, but once Russia was there, realized that it has a threat emerging from Turkey and a threat emerging from Iran, and what better way to manage your threat than to get the two of them to fight against each other. So what do? Make sure Assad stays alive as a buffer state. Make sure Iran isn't too powerful there, but also make sure Turkey doesn't overrun it. Keep those two powers squabbling with each other so they're not focusing on Russia and blocking Russia's access to the Bosporus or messing around in Central Asia where Iran has a lot of cultural and political influence, and Turkey, which is stronger in the Caucasus.
Which is to say nothing of the United States, which is a whole other can of worms for Russia there as well.
Well, the United States, though, has its own issues, and it starts poking around in these places because the United States wants to make sure that no land-based power can arise, and so the United States is doing the same things that it always did. But again, this is not two heavyweights slugging it out. This is the United States with interests everywhere. This is Russia very narrowly defining interests in certain key areas. The end result, though, is still mutually exclusive interests. Russia and the United States do have the same interests in some places. I'm on record as saying that I think that long-term Russia and the United States are going to cooperate more than they're going to clash in the Middle East because their interests line up more with each other than they don't. The big sticking point for Russia and the United States is Eastern Europe because the United States does not want to go back to a place where Russia has its influence in those old lands that the Soviet Union had, because then Russia does begin to amass the kind of power that led to the Cold War. So the United States is going to try and create a blocking position there, and Russia views that as a threat. And as long as that is true, you're going to get all kinds of things about elections and NGOs and Cold Wars, and I have this missile and you have that missile, and it all comes from, for me, that's the center of gravity.
Well, and that does kind of reek of the Cold War, though. I mean, like, strangely, incredibly, like the things that happen in Syria are to some degree going to determine the fate of Ukraine, which is kind of strange. That's just kind of how these things work sometimes. We have a little bit of time left. So what is the status of the standoff, real quickly, in Ukraine, if that is something that we can be brief about?
Look, Ukraine is the major unsolved issue here. And for Russia, I think Russia has accepted that most of Ukraine is now, generally speaking, pro-West, but there are certain lines that Russia does not want to see crossed. At the same time, Russia, if you look at the deployment of the Russian military, it's not in the Baltics, though everybody is afraid of the Baltics, and it's not really. A lot of the Russian military is forward deployed in the areas around Ukraine because Russia wants to be able to preserve that intimidation tactic. But look, for Russia, this cuts both ways. Now Ukraine is the West's problem. So Russia is happy for the West to try and deal with what's going on in Kiev, because even though the West has supported Ukraine up to a point, then you get the West saying, well, we want you to adopt, we want no more corruption in Kiev before we give you more money. That's actually something that the EU has said with Ukraine.
We all want a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think for Russia, they've accepted that, look, it was a major loss and a major embarrassment the way the Ukrainian revolution went down in 2014. They were forced into Crimea because it was a pretty weak position and they had to maintain themselves there. They are continuing to support that position in eastern Ukraine with the separatists to keep that going. But this is really the main, and there were some negotiations even last year which sort of looked like there was some progress being made between the United States and Russia. But this is what I say, these are mutually exclusive interests. The United States would love to break Ukraine off from Russia, and for Russia, Ukraine is a national security interest. With a cultural and political history of being aligned with the center in Moscow. So this is the place where another Cold War term that we might use is frozen conflict, and we've used that in our writing before. For me, I would just say this is where the rubber meets the road. This is where if you want to understand why Russia and the United States haven't been friends, even though George Bush said that he looked into Putin's soul, and even though Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton hit the reset, and even though Trump has a closer relationship with Russia than most, it's because the interests just don't allow for it. It's you can want to be friends with Russia all you want, and Russia can want to be friends with the U.S. all it wants. At the end of the day, though, Russia has to protect the Russian people and the Russian nation, and that means doing things that the United States doesn't want Russia to do. And at a certain point, geopolitics is both that simple and that complicated. There's no solution that's going to make all parties happy there, and the best you can hope for is a kind of stalemate.
Wow, aim high, right?
Aim high, miss small.
High. All right, well, thanks a lot. Thanks for taking the time, and we'll see you all next week.
For more geopolitical insights from the team at Geopolitical Futures, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter using the link in the description.